So that's Andreas Kluth. He wrote this article from Bloomberg, and it's discussing, as I mentioned, the left-leaning coalition government of Berlin, Germany, introducing unprecedented rent controls, which were implemented in 2020, about a full year ago. He says that lots of economists warned against it. So what do the numbers say now? A thread. And that's the article in question. Berlin's rent controls are proving to be a disaster. And we'll go over a couple of details in that in just a moment. But in this thread, so firstly, he discussed what the policy is. If you look down first, before we discuss what's going on, you'll see that the policy, it was announced between 2019 and 2020, and then actually enacted in the early part of 2020. Let's go back up. The legislation split Berlin's housing into two different factions. You have one that's regulated and capped in residencies that were built before 2014, and then the unregulated and uncapped facilities that were built since 2014. And he even highlights here that in the regulated market, as expected, and as it's cited in many other reports that have been done on rent controls over the decades, rents plummet relative to those in other cities. So going back to this graph, you'll see that Berlin rent relative to the next 13 largest German cities was rising, quite a bit, and started to fall after this policy was announced. And then right before it was implemented, it didn't quite nosedive. It seems to have plateaued at about 60%, which means that the rate of growth, from what I understand here, I'm not an economist, I'm not a statistician, but the way that I understand this graph to say is that if Berlin rents were growing, relative to all these other cities, now its pace of growth has pretty much plateaued at being about 40%, relative to what it was. So effectively, the rates in Berlin you will find are, 40% on average greater, as opposed to, they're going to see a 40% difference in the rents, as opposed to seeing, a much greater difference. Like I said, I'm not a professional with this shit. I'm just a regular guy who's trying to really understand this shit on a better level. He goes on to discuss that the excess demand has to go somewhere, so the rents in the unregulated market start soaring. This is also something that's well documented in tons of other rent control research over the decades. The policy was announced again, and it started to rise, and then went down a little bit. Then the policy was enacted, and it has continued to grow at a certain pace. So, a left-wing coalition government implemented strict rent control measures in a major European city in a time when affordable housing and homelessness are critical issues around the world amidst an economic slowdown due to COVID-19, while our political and social institutions seem the least effective they've ever been in addressing not only the basic needs of their citizens, but also addressing the growing polarization of our cultural discourse. So then exactly what's the problem with rent control then? Well, firstly, rent control is a pretty antiquated idea. It's been around for centuries, and while it still has its place in different situations, it has largely been replaced by measures like rent stabilization, which offer a lot more flexibility in the arrangement between tenants and landlords and, investors and whatnot. And for an example of this, we can look to California. Governor Gavin Newsom in 2019 implemented a measure that mandated rents could not increase by more than 5% each year. Not to be outdone by Californians, rent advocates in St. Paul, Minnesota are pushing for a ballot initiative for November in 2021 that will allow voters to implement a policy that will limit rent increases to no more than 3% over a 12-month period.